Your next trip to the polls could look a little different. President Trump says he will issue a new executive order mandating voter identification from every voter.
Trump announced the news on Truth Social, writing this: voter ID must be part of every single vote. No exceptions. I will be doing an executive order to that end. He also added, also no mail-in voting except for those that are very ill and the far-away military.
Mandated voter ID has long been an item on Trump's wish list. Currently, there are 36 states that have laws requesting or requiring voters to show some form of identification at the polls. The other states, plus Washington, D.C., use other methods to verify the identity of voters.
Well, I have no particular opposition to voter ID requirements or showing ID. I think that's perfectly fine, and if you can't figure out how to do that, then you have no business voting, and I don't have any problem with it. Where I disagree probably with some conservatives who back this is that they seem to think, and I guess Trump seems to think, that limiting or in some ways making it a little bit, usually not difficult, but slightly more troubling to vote will be helpful to the electoral prospects of the Republican Party. There's now zero evidence of that, and if anything, it's the opposite. I've analyses, not from the right, from Nate Silver type people have shown that having more people voting in the last election would have increased Donald Trump's popular vote win. It used to be the case, certainly, that Democrats benefited from mass turnout, but given the Democrats are now doing best with very reliable older voters, wealthier voters, better educated voters, more civically engaged voters, and Trump is doing better with first-time voters, minority voters, lower-income voters, less well-educated voters. This whole make it more, it's a plan that doesn't make no sense. Now, that's not to say that our voter laws should be written some way to benefit one part or the other, but given that I suspect that's what animating this, it's a little silly. But I don't care if you have to show ID. Now, it should not. I don't want anything done by executive order. It should be done by Congress. But
right. So as is often the case with Trump moves, there are two separate strands to this. There's the abstract argument that can be made for the thing, and there's the fact that it's Trump who's proposing it. As for the abstract argument on the thing, I have become increasingly sympathetic to voter ID. I just don't think the arguments against it are really strong enough, and people do make the very valid point that we need to show ID for so much all the time that to suggest that it is an excessively cumbersome requirement for voting seems fairly dubious. Now, mail-in voting, I think that is a very separate issue. I am not remotely persuaded by Trump's argument that mail-in voting is inherently dangerous, inherently insecure, or whatever. There is a broader argument to be made about where, essentially where there are particularly older black voters whose birth records sometimes have slightly different spellings of their names because they were born at a time when frankly there wasn't very much care taken about in officialdom to record things correctly, and whether it would place a burden on them. But I take your point that overall the idea, which was prevalent until quite recently, that a lower turnout election would benefit Republicans and a higher turnout election would benefit Democrats, that's, I think, very much in question. On the Trump thing, and I'd be fairly brief about it, just the fact that the fact that it's him putting this forward, whenever in 2020 he made such enormous efforts to change the result of an election that people had validly cast their votes in, not only in terms of inspiring January the 6th, but in terms of fake elector schemes, in terms of false representations to state legislatures, in terms of a fundamental attempt to deny the right of people to have their votes counted fairly. That makes me just I consider it risible to suggest that Donald Trump personally cares about the integrity of the electoral process.
And he told his people not to vote with mail-in ballots, so then this should be no surprise that that was not a process that for which a disproportionate number of Trump votes were obtained, and also that the day of totals looked more favorable to Trump, and then when they counted the votes from the method he told his people not to use, that tipped more the other way, which was a totally natural progression that conservatives said, oh, there's something fishy about this, but that you told them not to vote that way.
And people had predicted that exactly that pattern would play itself out as the votes were counted.
But like you said, I think being very opposed to voter ID laws, the arguments summoned on there. You can always say there isn't all that much fraud, which I accept, although I always cite the anecdote of I did have two ballots mailed to my apartment last time around, and actually 1 year my ballot didn't show up. I requested an absentee, which I think is slightly different than the mail-in.
Right, it's slightly different categorization.
It's also different everywhere, and I love federalism, and I love having states and cities and everyone be able to do their own thing for the most part. Although there's a couple procedural things like this that almost something about standardizing it appeals to me, or even being able to do it like online, which maybe that would be way too security averse, or maybe we'd have to do two-factor authentication to log into our voter, which by then we might as well just give up the process of democracy entirely. Yeah,
look, so long as the votes are traceable in some ways, whether it's in the event of a recount or the event of doubts or skepticism being raised. I think where there is the real danger is whenever people feel that they can't prove whether they voted one way or another, and it's open to chicanery. The federalism thing, to be fair, does give a measure of protection, at least makes elections harder to rig or harder to, because they're all different and different processes.
But the federal government knows our social security number, and you have a driver's license, and you might have a passport, and those are pretty standardized methods of identification, and almost everybody has one of those things, and you can get one of those things or something like one of those things with not very much difficulty. You need to travel, got to get a passport. Walk into a bar, you got to have your ID up to date. You got to even have it up to date. I have a buddy who has been too lazy to have his ID. This happened to me once, probably 10 years ago, that my driver's license got out of date, and I forgot to update it, and you had to schedule an appointment to do it, and it's really annoying, but I couldn't buy any of my cherished red wines until
you were spurned from
I'm like, but it still says my name on it. It's not, like, no, it's expired. I'm like, all right, that's how it works.
Yeah, no, I mean, those things are fair. I just get back to the point that I do not believe that Donald Trump has a sincere interest in making the voting system have greater integrity. I think all the evidence from his entire political career is that he is animated by either a desire to cast aspersion on fair votes or on trying to game the system more broadly to give him a greater chance of winning.
Sometimes I wonder what information gets back to him. Not him specifically, anyone in a political context or important person, like, have any of his people who are around him, Caroline Levitt or whatever advisors, said, hey, you know what? I read this really interesting Substack piece about how if more people voted and there was less voter ID requirements, you would have even done better. Does anyone say that to him? I just genuinely wonder if that argument, which I think is pretty straightforward, has ever made its way to his ears.
No, I think that's a fair point. And actually, we'll see in the midterms whether he's able, while not being on the ballot himself, to generate increased turnout for Republicans, or whether that was something that seemed very specific.
Right, that's the danger, that when Trump's not there himself to inspire his people to turn out, the very inspired anti-Trump people have a kind of advantage. So
absolutely.
We will find out that.
We will indeed. Coming up, more than 70 Guatemalan children were set to be deported over the weekend, but a judge stopped the process at the last minute. We'll have more on that. Stay with us.